Before there were banks on every corner, before there was a dollar bill that looked the same in every state, before anyone had ever heard the words credit score, there was the river, the Mississippi, muddy, wide, unforgiving, and alive. For over 100 years, it was the vein that fed a growing nation, and the families who lived along its banks, who worked its currents, who raised their children in the sway of paddle wheels and steam whistles, learned something most of us have forgotten. They learned how to survive on almost nothing. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. The river remembers what the banks forgot. Today, we're going back. Back to the flatboats and shanty towns, the steamboat docks and cotton warehouses, the floating grocers and dry goods peddlers who built an entire hidden economy on the water. We're going to uncover the lost money rules, the quiet, ironclad habits that riverboat families lived by. Rules passed down not in books, but in whispers around a coal oil lamp. Rules that meant the difference between a family eating come January or not.
To understand the money rules, you first have to understand the world that made them necessary. Picture the Mississippi River sometime between 1820 and 1880. This wasn't just a body of water. It was the interstate highway, the internet, and the marketplace of the American frontier, all rolled into one churning brown ribbon. Steamboats groaned up and down its length, carrying cotton, sugar, timber, and passengers. Flatboats, simple one-way wooden rafts, floated cargo downriver to New Orleans, then were broken apart and sold for lumber because rowing them back upstream wasn't worth the effort. And along the banks, in shanty boats, dog-trot cabins, and clapboard river towns, lived thousands of families whose entire existence depended on the river's moods. These families weren't wealthy. Most weren't even what we'd call middle class today. Deckhands, roustabouts, fisherfolk, small farmers, laundresses, blacksmiths, ferrymen, traders. Their income was seasonal, unpredictable, and often paid not in cash but in credit at the company store, in barter, or in scrip that was only good in one town. And yet, here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Many of these families were financially savvier than the average household today. Not because they had more money, because they had almost none, and none of it to waste. Poverty, when it doesn't break you, has a way of sharpening the mind. And the river families sharpened theirs into an entire unwritten code. Transition. Sound of a steamboat whistle. Fade to a family gathered around a small table by lamplight. Let's walk through that code, rule by rule. The first rule sounds strange to modern ears. Never let cash sit still. Today, we're taught to save money, to let it sit in an account and grow. But cash, in the 19th century river economy, was actually one of the riskiest things a family could hold on to. Why? Because paper money wasn't standardized. Before the National Banking Act of 1863, thousands of different banks across the country issued their own paper currency, and a lot of it was worthless outside the town or state where it was printed. Riverboat families called this wildcat money, and a bill that was worth $1 in Louisville might be worth 60 cents in Vicksburg, or nothing at all. So the rule wasn't spend everything immediately. The rule was convert cash into something stable as fast as possible. That might mean trading it for tools that wouldn't rust away in value. It might mean converting it into store credit at a trusted merchant who kept an honest ledger. It might mean turning it into salt, flour, or seed corn, goods that held real, tangible value, no matter what a bank 3 states away decided $1 was worth that week. Families kept what little coin they had, real silver and gold, which held value everywhere, separate from paper money, often sewn into a hem or hidden in a jar buried near the hearth. Paper was for spending fast. Coin was for keeping. Think about that for a second. These families had already figured out something that took modern economists generations to formalize. Cash that isn't backed by trust is a melting ice cube. Move it into something real before it disappears. There's a story, passed down through oral history collected from families along the lower Mississippi, of a woman named Odessa Cargill, a laundress near Baton Rouge in the 1850s. She was paid partly in banknotes from a bank up in Illinois. Within 2 weeks, that bank had failed. The notes were paper, worthless paper. Odessa's response?
The second rule was about something we now call reputation. But on the river, they just called it your name. River towns were small. Everybody knew everybody, and word traveled up and down the banks faster than the current itself. So when a family borrowed on credit from the local store, which nearly everyone did at some point, especially between harvests, there was an unspoken understanding. The river gives credit once. Miss a payment, fail to settle up before the next boat came through, and that credit vanished. Not just at that store, often at every store within rowing distance, because shopkeepers talked. They compared notes on porches, at church, at the landing while waiting for the mail packet. This created a fierce, almost sacred discipline around debt. Families would go without, skip a meal, patch a garment for the 5th time, sell a treasured item, rather than let a debt go unpaid. Not because they feared jail, though that was a real possibility in some places. They feared something worse, losing their name. There's a particularly moving account from a river family near Cape Girardeau, Missouri, recorded by a folklorist in the 1930s while interviewing the descendants of steamboat workers. The family patriarch, a boiler tender named Thomas Reddick, once walked 12 miles in winter. 12 miles! To personally deliver 50 cents to a shopkeeper before a boat left port, because he'd promised the debt would be settled by the boat, and he intended to keep his word, even though the shopkeeper hadn't been expecting him for another week. 50 cents.
Here's a phrase you'd have heard often in a river shanty. Nothing floats away twice. It meant this: if the river gives you something, whether by luck, storm, or a boat's misfortune, you use every last bit of it, because you will likely never see anything like it again. The Mississippi was a river of waste, in the most literal sense. Steamboats sank with regularity. By some estimates, over 1,000 steamboats met their end on the river during the 19th century, from boiler explosions, snags, fires, and sandbars. Cargo spilled. Barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, crates of nails and tools would wash up along the banks for miles. River families became expert scavengers, not out of desperation alone, but as an entire economic philosophy. Driftwood became firewood or lumber for repairs. Spilled grain, if dry enough, fed chickens or was ground for meal. Broken barrels became furniture, wash basins, even cradles. Torn sailcloth became clothing, curtains, or bandages. This wasn't hoarding. It was a deep, practiced understanding that resources on the river came in unpredictable waves, and the families who thrived were the ones who wasted nothing during the good waves because they knew the lean ones were coming. There's a wonderful, almost folkloric detail here. Some river families kept what they called a flood chest, a trunk specifically for items salvaged after high water or a wreck, sorted and stored for future use, sometimes not touched for years until exactly the right need arose. A sort of 19th century emergency fund, except instead of dollars, it was full of usable cloth, tools, and hardware. Try explaining that concept to a modern minimalist influencer. Nothing was viewed as trash. Everything had a next life. A rusted nail was straightened and reused. A cracked plate became a scoop or a garden marker. A worn-out dress became quilt scraps, then rag rugs, then eventually kindling. Here's a phrase you'd have heard often in a river shanty. Nothing floats away twice. It meant this: if the river gives you something, whether by luck, storm, or a boat's misfortune, you use every last bit of it, because you will likely never see anything like it again. The Mississippi was a river of waste, in the most literal sense. Steamboats sank with regularity. By some estimates, over 1,000 steamboats met their end on the river during the 19th century, from boiler explosions, snags, fires, and sandbars. Cargo spilled. Barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, crates of nails and tools would wash up along the banks for miles. River families became expert scavengers, not out of desperation alone, but as an entire economic philosophy. Driftwood became firewood or lumber for repairs. Spilled grain, if dry enough, fed chickens or was ground for meal. Broken barrels became furniture, wash basins, even cradles. Torn sailcloth became clothing, curtains, or bandages. This wasn't hoarding. It was a deep, practiced understanding that resources on the river came in unpredictable waves, and the families who thrived were the ones who wasted nothing during the good waves because they knew the lean ones were coming. There's a wonderful, almost folkloric detail here. Some river families kept what they called a flood chest, a trunk specifically for items salvaged after high water or a wreck, sorted and stored for future use, sometimes not touched for years until exactly the right need arose. A sort of 19th century emergency fund, except instead of dollars, it was full of usable cloth, tools, and hardware. Try explaining that concept to a modern minimalist influencer. Nothing was viewed as trash. Everything had a next life. A rusted nail was straightened and reused. A cracked plate became a scoop or a garden marker. A worn-out dress became quilt scraps, then rag rugs, then eventually kindling.
Every riverboat family understood one unshakable truth about the Mississippi. It rises and it falls. And when the water dropped low, especially in late summer and early autumn, steamboat traffic slowed to a crawl. Boats ran aground on sandbars, trade stalled, wages dried up. Store for the low water was the rule that governed the entire rhythm of a riverboat family's year. This meant that whatever money, goods, or food came in during high water season, when boats ran constantly, when cargo needed loading and unloading, when work was plentiful, had to be treated as a resource for the entire year, not just the moment. Smoking and salting fish, canning garden vegetables, drying fruit on the roof in the sun, rendering lard, pickling anything that could survive a jar. These weren't hobbies. They were the literal insurance policy against the months when the river simply stopped providing work. A family working together, children stringing dried apples, a father salting a barrel of fish. There's something beautifully instructive in how this rule extended beyond food. Families stored for low water emotionally too, maintaining relationships with multiple employers, multiple trading partners, multiple potential sources of income, so that if one dried up, others might still flow. A deckhand might also know carpentry. A laundress might also serve as an informal midwife. A farmer's son might also apprentice part-time with the blacksmith. Diversification wasn't a financial buzzword to them. It was survival, plain and simple. And it's a lesson that feels remarkably urgent today in an economy.
Perhaps the most quietly radical of all the riverboat rules was this. Children were taught real money management, starting almost as soon as they could count. Teach the child the coin wasn't a metaphor. Children on the river were given actual responsibilities involving actual money and goods, often shockingly early by today's standards. A child of 7 or 8 might be trusted to go to the general store with exact instructions on what could be traded for what, and expected to return with the correct goods and the correct change, down to the penny. Why so early and so seriously? Because in a family with thin margins, a child who didn't understand money wasn't just uneducated, they were a liability. And more than that, riverboat parents understood something we've largely forgotten, that financial competence isn't innate. It's trained through repetition, through small, real stakes, long before the stakes become large. Children learn to recognize which paper currency was trustworthy and which wasn't. They learn to spot a short change at the market, a real risk in an era of unstandardized coinage. They learn the difference between a fair trade and an unfair one, and were expected to negotiate on the family's behalf, sometimes as young as 10 or 11. By the time these children reached adulthood,
Not every rule the riverboat families lived by was about spreadsheets and coin counting. Some were emotional disciplines. Because financial survival on the Mississippi wasn't just a math problem, it was a psychological one. Grieve quick, mend fast captured an attitude that river families needed to survive. When disaster struck, a lost boat, a ruined crop, a burned cabin, there was a narrow window allowed for mourning the loss. And then the family moved, deliberately and immediately, into rebuilding. This wasn't about suppressing emotion. Grief was real, and it was honored. But river life offered no luxury of prolonged paralysis. The next flood, the next low water season, the next boat was always coming, whether a family was ready or not. Families who spent too long in shock, in blame, in despair, often found themselves even further behind when the next challenge arrived. A scene, a community gathering to help rebuild a burned-out cabin, neighbors carrying lumber, cooking meals. This is where the river community itself becomes part of the financial story, because riverboat families didn't face disaster alone. When a family lost a boat, a cabin, or a season's crop, neighbors gathered, bringing tools, spare lumber, preserved food, a spare set of hands. This wasn't formalized charity. It was mutual insurance, built entirely on relationship and reputation, the same reputation that Rule 2 protected so fiercely. A family that had always paid its debts, always shown up to help others rebuild after their own disasters.
Timing on the river was everything, and riverboat families built an entire money philosophy around it. The boat doesn't wait, and neither should your money, meant that opportunities on the river economy were often fleeting, and hesitation was expensive. When a boat docked, there might be a window of only an hour or two to sell goods, trade, or pick up work before it pushed off again, sometimes not returning for weeks. This created a kind of urgency-based financial instinct. Families who succeeded on the river developed a sharp sense for acting when opportunity appeared, rather than waiting for a better moment that might never come. If a boat needed firewood and a family had firewood ready, they sold it immediately, even if they suspected the next boat might pay slightly more. A guaranteed sale now was worth more than a hypothetical better price later, because later on the river was never promised. But this rule had a flip side too, and it's the part often missed. It wasn't about recklessness, it was about preparedness meeting opportunity. Families kept their goods ready before the boat arrived, precisely so they wouldn't have to scramble and make poor decisions under pressure. Firewood was already split, fish were already smoked, goods were already sorted and priced. The lesson here is a subtle but powerful one. Readiness is what allows good timing to become profitable timing. A family caught unprepared when the boat arrived either missed the opportunity entirely or made a rushed bad trade out of desperation. A family that was ready struck fast and struck well.
We're nearing the end of our journey down the river, and this second-to-last rule might be the most emotionally resonant of all. Amid all this relentless calculation, every coin converted, every debt tracked, every scrap of driftwood repurposed, riverboat families held fiercely to one final rule: keep one thing that isn't for sale. No matter how desperate things became, no matter how tempting an offer, every family kept back at least one item that would never be traded, sold, or bartered away, regardless of the price offered. It might be a wedding ring, a family Bible with names recorded inside the cover, a small carved toy from a child who had passed, a quilt sewn by a grandmother who'd crossed the ocean. This wasn't financial foolishness. It was, in its own way, one of the wisest habits of all. Because a family that has been stripped of everything, that has sold every possession, every heirloom, every trace of identity just to survive one more season, loses something that's much harder to rebuild than a bank account. They lose their sense of who they are. By keeping one untouchable item, riverboat families protected a kind of psychological reserve, a reminder in the hardest times of what they were actually working for. Not money for its own sake. Family, continuity, dignity. There's a quiet lesson in this for us today, in a world where everything increasingly feels like it has a price tag, where just sell it is often the first piece of advice for anyone in financial trouble. The River families understood something we've started to lose. Some things, once sold, take far more than money to replace.
And now, the rule I promised you at the very beginning. The one almost nobody talks about anymore. The river teaches only once. Riverboat families understood that every mistake, a bad trade, an unpaid debt, a wasted resource, an unprepared moment when opportunity knocked, carried a real cost. And that cost was rarely available to pay twice. There was no bailout, no safety net beyond your neighbor's goodwill, no second chance from a bank that didn't exist yet, on a frontier that owed you nothing. So the river demanded something modern life rarely demands from us anymore: full attention. Every trade mattered, every coin mattered, every relationship mattered. And because mistakes were expensive, riverboat families paid close, careful attention to the lessons the river taught, and passed those lessons down, rule by rule, story by story, to the next generation standing on the dock. We've lost a lot of that attention today, not because we're careless people, but because our modern financial systems are designed to absorb mistakes. Credit that resets, banks that insure, apps that autocorrect a missed payment. That's not a bad thing, exactly. But it's worth asking what we've traded away in exchange for that cushion. A little bit of that river sharpness, that instinct to notice, to track, to prepare, to value what we have, instead of assuming there's always more coming. The steamboats are gone now. The shanty towns have mostly washed away or faded into quiet river parks. But if you listen closely, in old family letters, in oral histories recorded,
If any of these rules struck a chord with you, I'd love to know which one hit hardest. Drop it in the comments below. And if you want to go further down this river of forgotten wisdom, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering the lost financial habits of the people history left behind. Until next time, stay sharp, stay careful with what the current gives you, and I'll see you on the next stretch of river.